Okay, I'm going to start. Thank you for coming. I hope you've seen all the 3 shows. I mean, 2 rooms for this show and Wendy's show in the back. I wanted to start with the inception of these pieces, which is really from my childhood, where I developed this practice of seeing, who knows how that happens, kind of instinctively, that has stood me really in good stead. So that was, I would come home from school, and fortunately, I lived in a town, but we had a nice big backyard, and then there were these fields, 2 fields, and a brook. It seemed like a long journey when I was a child, a big adventure, and woods. It couldn't have been better. And I would sit down in the field, kind of getting rid of school, and I would wait. Somehow I knew I had to wait and that I had to let everything settle down. And initially I would just see, some grass and maybe some ants, something like that. And then something would shift, and there would be kind of this cinematic burst, and I would realize how alive everything was. All these things that were there the whole time, but I hadn't seen them. So, ants going up the daisy stalk, and aphids cleaning a plant, and birds are flying around and singing, and there's all this toil at the bottom with these different kinds of beetles. And oddly enough, this snake came almost every day in the afternoon, like there was a timetable, and you couldn't hear it, but I would see it, and it would disappear. I never found out where that snake went, but everything was alive. And I felt that this was what I needed, a kind of direct knowledge of things that was life-enhancing, I guess I would say. So that's the beginning of things. And then this has continued, so this title for the show, Undiscovered Country, really is about these little events that happen in nature. I'm talking about nature because that informs most of my work. These events that kind of change your neurons. And I think of nature, of course, as in many scales. There's this very large scale where there's these big forces interacting and interdependent, the Gaia. And then there's these small events, and there's these scales in between. And I was thinking of an event that happened a few years ago where there was a large coastal storm in Maine. The kind you're not supposed to go out in. So my brother came along in a car, and he picked up my husband and me and my sister, and of course we went out in the storm, and we went to our favorite lookout place, and it was amazing. There was this huge ocean waves coming up, everything was gray, there was fog, the boulders were just staying in place, but everything else was moving around. And I looked up, and there was a seagull just suspended in the air, not moving, in one point. And it seemed like that went on for minutes. And then it must have moved a feather or something, and it got swept off stage. But there were these other seagulls waiting in the wing, so to speak. And they would try to come into this perfect airfoil point and see if they could find it. And some of them just got swept away. They were too high, they were too low, they were too moving too much. But others would find it, and they'd slot themselves in, and they would just stay there. And the wonder of that small event to me was, did they communicate with each other, or how did they all know that this airfoil was going on now, and we all better rush over to this point? And just how did they know how to do this thing, and were they playing? It seemed to me they were having a good time in the midst of this really wild, devastating force of nature. So that's what I mean about things that you can discover, but it takes something from you. So it takes something, you have to let your mind go a little bit and not be so self-concerned. And all these little events are available. And that very much informs my work. So hopefully you've seen the Red Room, which is called Ghost Species. And I just thought I would talk about how otherwise I arrived at my pieces. So that piece has a lot of influences. I'm just going to make a list of the influences. There's Herman Melville and his idea about ghost ships, and Benito Cellino. I don't know if you've read that story. It's fantastic. It's a little dark. There's the idea of a ghost species. This man, Stephen Myers, wrote a book called The End of the Wild that's really hard to read because it's kind of devastating, but it's important. And he wrote about ghost species and relic species and weed species, and we belong to the last humans, along with rats and coyotes, and the things that can survive and how we are now. And this idea of appearance and disappearance, and I feel also that nature really needs to get rid of us if it's gonna survive. Or there is that movement, it feels like. So there's this whole idea of disappearance. But I feel like all these influences are just subterranean. They're not, up front in my mind. And they kind of, one or two particles will filter up and they'll join together and they make something. And that becomes kind of like a molecule, and then there's these valence points where other things can hitch on. The very first part of the piece is that I call Kelp Barricade, was another small or big event, I don't know what scale I put it on, that happened in 2021, where my husband and I went out walking on the beach in Maine in the morning, and there were these giant mounds of seaweed. You could not push them over. They're huge. I figured out by extrapolation that they're probably 1,500 or 1,600 pounds. They were very densely packed. How did this happen? There were like 15 or 20 of them arranged down the beach. And it was just one of these events that's amazing, because a few days later, they were disappeared. And this goes along with my feeling about, I'm kind of attracted to this idea of appearance and disappearance. But I also had this feeling of this piece being kind of a barricade to the room, that you have to that we're being signaled or stopped by nature. Maybe that's too symbolic, I don't know. But somebody asked me why I made it red. And I thought, well, why not? And then I had a good time working with that color. But then I was thinking that these piles, I actually have two photos I'm forgetting to show you. These piles of seaweed, which were there and then were not there, and this is with this human scale, a lot of them had this red hue to them. And I don't know if you know, the Gulf of Maine is huge, and it goes out all the way to the Gulf Stream, that's on one edge, and then the Labrador Current comes down, it brings the cold water, so the Gulf Stream's bringing the warm water. But the Gulf of Maine is the fastest heating body of water in the world. And it's so sad to me. I mean, I feel like, yes, nature has these catastrophic events by itself that change the world, but we have contributed so much to this, this change. And what it's done to the seaweed, which is necessary to, and the kelp, that's necessary to everything that's going on in the ocean, is to devastate these kelp forests. And I think that's why they all came loose and washed up in the beach at that particular moment. And this red algae has been appearing on the seafloor. There wasn't that much of it before, and that came into these big kelp piles. So that's kind of the way I conceived of that room. I've had a conversation with somebody, it was a year ago, and I was talking about this show. We've had a conversation in the past about, do you start with an idea or not? And I always say, no, you don't start with an idea, it's unformed. And she says, yes, you start with an idea. And so I don't know where I am on that now. I think, yeah, I do start with ideas, because I was describing them, some of the ideas I wanted in the show. And one was, I wanted to have this hand that's up here. I wanted to have a kind of sky piece. I had wanted to do a giant cube of fog. That didn't happen. I haven't figured out how to do that.
Next time.
Anyway, she said, you can't do it. And that just made me dig my heels in. And I thought, I'm going to do it. But I understood what she meant later, which was, you can't, or the way I work, you can't imbue a piece with meaning. It doesn't work. It becomes very rigid. But you can just try to find out how to make the piece exist. And then maybe it can fill a room and come about and have its own presence. So I think that's what the meaning of that conversation was, and saying that I couldn't do it. To be careful about how you use things, and things that might be kind of symbolic. They need a lot of investment on your part to be careful not to impose your thinking too much. So I wanted to just say about this piece, it is a lot about place and displacement. And I think, we have so much trouble in the world from losing place. I feel like place is something almost instinctive, the way a wish for social interaction is instinctive. And, the downside of that is this term solastalgia. I did a show in the back room a couple years ago that made me actually kind of depressed. So I decided I couldn't completely go in that direction anymore. Depressed about climate change and absence of species. And solastalgia just means the loss of place and what it does, which is cause physical pain, cause psychic pain. But place also has this wonderful sense of somewhere that you feel at home. And it can be many, many places. You can have a love affair with place, and you can correspond to place. And once you realize that that's in you, I feel there's where I'm hopeful about things with the environment. I feel perhaps then we would be better stewards of the land, which obviously many people care about it and other people don't. And I'm kind of very nervous about the future now, but hopeful, more hopeful. So, and one other thing I'll just say about making, which is interesting, and I distorted this quote, but it's kind of stood me in good stead, which it sounds a little pretentious, but it's something that T.S. Eliot said. He said, plot is the bone you throw the dog so you can go in and rob the house. And I had changed that in my mind to content is the bone you throw the dog so you go in and rob the house. And that's how we think about making a piece, not being too literal, not being too tight, but really thinking about what is the substance of the piece without imposing. So anyway, that's what I have to say at the moment. And if you have any questions, yeah.
I think the undiscovered country is from Shakespeare.
Is it?
Yeah, and I think he meant death. But that's,
Oh, okay.
That is, I'm wondering if you had known
No,
that.
I didn't know that.
Oh, it's interesting that.
Yeah, it does go. I mean, I meant undiscovered country in two ways, of this kind of wonderful experience you can have that's available to you if you're open to it.
Yeah, yeah.
But then I've been also thinking about how are we going to act? How are we going to behave? There's a whole college that started around this in Wales, also called Black Mountain College, just about how are we going to deal with the changed planet. And
But the
death.
idea that you still haven't been there, but you will, you know.
Yeah.
And as an artist, you must feel, oh, that'll be interesting to see what's there.
Yeah.
So that would be my thinking. So it's a good time.
It's also from Star Trek.
Oh, it is?
Shakespeare.
So you're in a good place.
I'm glad of it such a good place.
Hamlet or like that.
Well, who knows what's going on in your brain?
It's also only 2 words.
What?
It's 2 words that you are putting together that have meaning for you. It's not a whole sentence,
Right.
you know, so I take all of these people have thought of good 2 words, including Rhonda.
Yeah.
Yeah. How are you?
Nice to, I'm not going to say as a part of it. It's good to see you, and I appreciated you talking about how you changed the way you saw things as you grew older.
The way I changed it?
The way you saw things as you grew older.
Oh,
From
yeah.
schoolgirl to how you're sort of noticing the same things, but are articulating it differently.
Yeah.
I'm very excited to see the change in scale.
Yeah.
Which really invites a lot of intimacy. I walked in, I haven't seen the rest of the show, but I wanted to tell you that.
Thank you.
Did you work on smaller like those before?
These are from 2 years ago. And I worked on them in my place in Maine, which is very small. But they're roots that are from eroded plants at the ocean. Yeah. And I did these 2 larger pieces also last summer, and everything else, yeah, since July.
When you talk about Black Mountain, isn't there another college?
There was one that was very experimental in
North Carolina.
in the Carolinas, yeah. And I don't know if the name of this came from, the new one came from that idea, or there's a Black Mountain where it is in Wales.
Mm-hmm. But we would drive by this every time we went to Will's Mother. We'd see the Black Mountain. And
Yeah.
It's not a national college anymore.
Right, right. But this new one is all around climate change. So, and how we're going to behave. So, and it started by this man, Ben Lawrence, who wrote a book called Tree Line, which is very good. I sound like a little London library here, but.
Your work seems, from what you say, it seems like it's kind of a struggle between hope and despair. And I'm really interested in just whatever you might want to say about, because it feels like you're able to hold on to a certain amount of hope that enables you to keep working. And like, it may be impossible to say how you do that, but I mean, anything you could say would be interesting to me.
Well, yeah, I feel like I'm always in the middle, and I feel like if you don't have any hope, I feel like it's a spring, like a life spring inside, and if you don't have any hope, you're dead. You die. I mean, I think that people who are pushed to the edge, and that's how we torture people, is we take away their hope.
Mm-hmm.
More even than dignity, we take away their hope. That you can't, I don't see how you live without it. There's something forward pulling, but at the same time, I feel strongly that it's my duty, or I don't know if that's the word, to bear this grief that I have over the environment, because I was so connected to it from, when I was tiny. And something certainly did come from my parents about, they both cared greatly about animals and plants, and I got that from them. So, how do you deal with it?
I don't know, it's really, the thing that you said that resonates with me is that you have to have some feeling of purpose, it seems like, or else, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of getting up or anything? But the purpose seems to vary from day to day, it's hard. You seem to have a very sustaining feeling of a purpose that's like a through line that runs through what you've been saying, and that, which is great. I don't quite feel like I have that, but I totally remember what it felt like to have that, and I see how important it is.
Well, it's probably the activity of making things that keeps me going. And I'm one of those throwbacks. I make things with my hands, and I feel very connected to that. And whatever is going to come out of it, a piece, connected to the accidents, connected to listening. That's my through line.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That was a good question.
Yeah, so to say, outside of I think that it's meshed together, the meaning of your theme of hope and despair related to the environment and what your relationship with nature. It's also every time you start a new piece of art, it's both hope and despair going on at the same time.
Yeah,
right?
it's true.
So it's so connected to the process of
that's
making
true.
a piece.
It's true.
Right.
Yeah.
And how do you decide where you're going to land and leave it?
And I think, I'm guessing you encounter some mistakes and some failures, but keeping that going,
Yeah.
accepting that somehow, and moving forward. The hope allows you to do that.
Are you referring to failures in the works you've made?
Yeah. Yeah, as a
Which every artist faces.
Right.
Could I ask, what's the story and perhaps intended meaning of, are those railroad spikes?
Those are railroad spikes. Yeah. And I actually paid money for those.
Oh, you didn't find them on the beach where the railroad was, right?
But I was in a salvage shop this summer, and I was very attracted to them. Like I was attracted to this metal, but I just feel like this is the combination of civilization, which, you know, everything we've made is so incredible, and, you know, the natural. And I always have that story in the back of my mind. Here's another thing that's in the sediment of my thinking, about the Golden Spike, where the two railroads met each other out west somewhere.
Mhm.
How marvelous that was, and then how devastating that was. I mean, everything's in that one little story has a kind of a dual effect. Yeah.
Well, not good for the buffalo, maybe, but
Pardon me?
not good for the
Well,
buffalo.
that's what I meant.
yes.
It's not good for many things. Yeah. Good and not good. Yeah. Anyway, we're gonna have, maybe we could get up and walk around a little bit, and then Wendy's gonna give her talk about the show and the project.